Diving Deeper Discussions. My name is John Wood, your host for this regular monthly series of discussions focused on an article or a book review that is published in our ASA journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. Today, we are thinking about the theology of reconciliation, in particular, reconciliation with creatures of the earth and the challenges and insights that have emerged as Christians have thought deeply, especially over the last 3 or 4 decades, about our relationship, not just with each other, reconciliation human to human, but to the entire creation. There are 2 individuals who've been a part of the Asabel Institute of Environmental Studies Graduate Fellows Program, and they're joining us today to discuss their article, The Imago Dei, A Bridge to Faith-Infused Reconciliation Ecology. It appeared in the September special issue of the ASA, and we want to welcome Abigail and David to Diving Deeper. Welcome.
Thanks.
Just great to have you with us. And I'm going to start with a little bit of back and forth Q&A with you, just so we get to know you, okay? And Abigail, let me start with you and ask, where are you from and kind of your path toward higher education?
So I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, and then I came to OSU for undergrad and then was like, well, I'm good at school. I should keep doing school, and did a PhD and found out that it's very different. Muddled my way through. Eventually I did finish. But one of the great parts of graduate school was the grad fellows program with Asabel and the community and the being able to be intellectually engaged with something outside of my daily grad work, which was not very fulfilling a lot of times, just the drudgery of like failure and stuff. So that's been a big part of my vocation, I think, as thinking about those things. And then I ended up, I'm teaching at OSU. That wasn't my plan, but COVID happened, and that's where I am, and I'm really enjoying teaching. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, Abigail, that's a common pathway. Many ASAers end up getting to undergrads and grad school. Suddenly they find themselves going after a PhD, whether they want to or not, right? And, and engineering and failure is really an interesting combination. Engineers just make things fail so they won't. So engaging with failure, that's another whole conversation we'll have another time. David, let me turn to you and get a little bit on your background, then I'll come back to Abigail. So your journey.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in New Hampshire, went to school in upstate New York. While I was studying engineering, I was actually chemical engineering. At one point, I thought, I like this, but I don't want to spend all my time inside thinking about pipes, right? I wonder if I can do this while thinking about rivers and trees. So I Googled ecological engineering, found out it was a real thing, and started applying to graduate schools. So that landed me at Ohio State University, where I met Abby. I was originally planning on staying only for a master's, but they get you by saying, apply to the PhD program, you'll get more funding. And then when I was finishing up my master's and trying to decide what to do next, I actually felt very convicted that I should choose a place rather than a job. And I ended up choosing Columbus, Ohio as my place. And then just the easiest way to be in Columbus was to get a PhD. I was already in the program, I already had funding, I had a cool idea for a project. So I ended up in the PhD program as well.
Wow.
But a lot of not a lot of academic success, but a lot of really good relational fruit came out of that decision, I'd say.
Very good, David. Thank you for that. Interesting. What year was it that you were Googling environmental engineering programs?
Yeah, ecological engineering
Ecological
specifically. That would have been 2008, probably.
Okay.
So the room
Yeah,
is
it was early in my undergraduate career.
The room is buzzing right now. That's an interesting year. At Asabel, I was the academic dean at that time at Asabel, and actually working on an ecological environmental engineering program that Asabel had intended to launch. And if those of you who might not know, the Asabel Institute is really the oldest and largest of the Christian environmental institutes and field stations. They have nearly 200 undergraduates every year in programming. It's probably the second or third largest undergraduate environmental summer program for education, and there are over 5,000 alumni who've been there either in the undergraduate program or, as you two have, in the graduate fellows program. A little shout out for that. If you know someone who's interested in graduate school through the ASA elsewhere and interested in environmental questions, there's a great reading program and engagement. And I know that John Terry, the current executive director and president of the board, would be happy to talk to you about that.
I'm actually involved in helping run that, so just
so there you are. Just get a hold of Abigail.
Yeah.
Send her a text or an email, and there we go.
Yeah.
So lots of connections here. It's very interesting. So let me drop back and just touch on your faith journey just a bit and how that connects to your discipline. Abigail, let's start with you.
Yeah. So I grew up in a Christian home. We were at church multiple times a week. My mother especially she's very thrifty, and I think through the thriftiness, like concern for environmental conservation. So like we were always we would recycle everything, but there was not a connection to faith. That was just another like a civic kind of duty. But I think by the end of undergrad, beginning of grad school, and this was when David came into Columbus, so I have a distinct memory of us walking I think he was a prospective student. We were walking along the river and talking about like, oh, well, Jesus became incarnated as and fleshed himself. And so then that's, if the matter must matter, that kind of conversation. And so it's been very tied in for me with just general vocational questions and reading, and lots of reading through the Ensemble Grad Fellows program and just thinking about these things. And then I think right now, I think for both David and I, a big thing is that we feel a calling to help teach and help other Christians think about this who aren't necessarily thinking about it. So we've taught a couple times in our church, but that's just something we want to keep doing. And so connecting it to, that's kind of the point of the article, is connecting it to a theological idea, a doctrine that we should all agree on, that we are all made in the image of God. So then connecting that to the idea of caring for creation. So.
Yeah, very good. We're going to come back to that theological connection with the doctrine, because I think that's vital and the centerpiece of the importance of this contribution. So David, take us on your faith journey to academia.
Sure. So I also grew up in a Christian household, one that was not particularly in tune with environmental concerns, I'd say, but I also grew up in the woods of New Hampshire. So very much for me, an important part of connecting to God was being outside, going on walks in the woods and seeing him there. So I knew I wanted to pursue an environmental related career, but I didn't really understand how. And I knew I had some kind of faith-based motivation for that, but I did not understand how to put them together. My last year in undergraduate, I roomed with a graduate philosophy student who was a Christian, who just like opened my eyes to the world of Christian scholarship. Like, oh, these are questions I can ask. And I started asking this question: what does Christianity have to say about the environment? I very clearly remembering coming home and asking someone who I respected deeply. He was in seminary, he was studying, right, to be a pastor. I remember thinking, oh, I bet my theology of the body is a connection to this. And I asked him, and he said, oh, your body is going to decay. That's it. And I remember being very dissatisfied with that. So I came to Ohio State the next year with all of these questions, but no clear way to pursue them. So I met Abby also asking those questions. Eventually, one of my housemates like forced me to have lunch with this professor, Greg Hitzhusen, who, because he's like, you're asking the same questions he's asking. And Greg told me that he wanted to restart the Ensemble Grad Fellows at Ohio State.
Yeah.
So that was very much an answer to prayer.
Right.
And Abby and I both joined that. That was the winter of
13?
13 to 14.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or well, 12 to
Was it 12 to 13?
you came in 12, right?
I
Or did
came
you
in
come
12. I thought there was a year when, yeah, I don't.
maybe. Anyway.
Yeah, whichever year we went to see Wendell Berry, because that was the first thing we did with
Yeah.
that novel, which
Yeah.
was wild. Yeah,
I
very
didn't
much.
even know who he was
I didn't either.
at that point.
Yeah.
So
Turns out he's a big deal.
Yeah.
thank you so much for this. Folks, if you don't know, we're a bunch of Ensemble alums and Ensemblites, right? So we start talking, telling stories, and it's going to be all about that for the hour. So thank you, David.
Yeah.
I just can't resist. We had David close the curtains behind him in the window there, and because the sun was shining through, and it just was a white light. But there's just some beautiful eastern white pines. He's at his folks' place, in the forest in New Hampshire. I grew up on the West Coast with Lauren Wilkinson and Randy Van Drott, names that you guys will know for sure. Randy and Lauren grew up on the West Coast like I did, in these old growth coniferous forests. And I don't know how you grow up in that and not love the creation and love the creator. It feels like it just sort of comes in the atmosphere and out of the earth and the streams and the lakes, and it's a beautiful place. All right, with all of that, let me go to the particulars of this article. Fascinating. It's a theological discussion, the doctrine of the Imago Dei, a really important one. You cast it in a very different framing than is typical in conservative church circles. We've journeyed over this doctrine of the creation, but you don't deal so much with the doctrine of creation. The doctrine of Imago Dei is where how did that happen? And just tell us a little bit about that. Abigail, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think we started. There was a mountain somehow, and we ended up anyway. I don't know. We had all of these ideas about what metaphors we were using, but the idea is that as Christians, as like the ecologist-ish people, then we've come to this. It's easy for us to see that like creation matters and is degraded, right, in a lot of ways. But that has been a hard vocation to bring and explain to people in the church who don't have that background. So making a connection, so that's the bridge. So that's why we really wanted to start with the Imago Dei. And the Imago Dei is very much a part of creation care discussions. So that's not a new thing there. But so the works of Middleton, The Liberating Image was one of the key pieces there. And then Carmen Imes' book, Being God's Image, is a little more accessible, but also excellent. Those are two books if you're interested in diving more into this. And if you're interested in diving deeper. So that was kind of where we started and saying, okay, well, if this is a common ground that we have, then we can go further and convince you that how you interact with creation matters and that you should be reconciled to it, and that there is a break, and then that you should be reconciled.
That's interesting because reconciliation is not often placed over against or together with the care for the creation. So, David, you want to add some more to that? Any of your side of that?
I think I'll just say I think we got to the centrality of the image of God over the course of our teaching the subject at our church. So we first taught, was that in 2016 or 2017?
Something like that.
So we had proposed a class on creation care to our church. So we taught it once then, which was good. It was kind of like, hey, we've been in ensemble for 3 or so years at that point, and here are things that we're learning. We taught it again in 2019, and our community had recently discovered N.T. Wright, so we were talking a lot about vocation, and it suddenly became clear to us that vocation was a really fruitful lens through which to view creation care. And then I don't know if we explicitly associated the image of God with it then, but I think Abby especially had been doing reading on the image of God in the time between then and now, and that felt like a very natural way to frame kind of our approach to it, which has been really, really fruitful for me to think about as well.
And
Yeah.
the article or the special issue is kind of coming, it's the 10-year anniversary of a previous special issue on reconciliation ecology, and the article by Dave Warners and Randall Van Drought and Michael Reiskamp, that they had the term reconciliation ecology is from them, and faith-infused reconciliation ecology is from them. So we were kind of taking, like, that idea is not ours, right? We were, although we did acronyminize it.
Yes.
Yes.
We said this should be an acronym, FIRE.
Yeah.
And we're going to come back to fire in a minute. Not to fire you, but to talk about fire and your acronym. I thank you for that, because it's really important to I think, touch the roots of where this comes from. Randy Van Drought and David Warners, two profs at Calvin University. And Calvin has been deeply involved with the Ensemble Institute over the years, and both of them have taught many, many years at the Ensemble Institute. And it was out of that community these ideas of reconciliation ecology were generated. And they proposed a course and taught it for many years. And we think it was likely one of the first reconciliation ecology courses taught at the undergraduate level, certainly in North America. I think when they started, they might have identified one or two others at comprehensive universities. So that shows you what happens when you bring a community of believers together with academic interests and skills that are the same, and you focus them together. Some really interesting cutting edge ideas come out. Reconciliation is ecology is not always with that term, is a very important thread in conservation biology for those of you who are not in the field. But it also has, as you point out in the article, it has implications and threads into lots of other discussions. So I'll stop with all of that. I think that gives us, there's one other thing. Tell us, David, we'll start you. Where are you working right now? Just briefly. And what is your title or whatever?
Sure. I am a research specialist for Engineering Ministries International in Uganda. So we are an engineering and architecture design firm that serves Christian ministries, mostly overseas. I do research and development, which means I cause trouble by asking people if they can do things differently, but then trying to back that up with data. As part of that, I've been able to join a group pushing us to think more about creation care within the organization, which has been really rewarding. So definitely trying to balance a bunch of things there, but ask as a group, how are we, as we develop infrastructure, how are we caring for the creation as well?
Very good. Thank you, David. And Abigail, you've told us you're at Ohio State, is it?
Yep. So I am a lecturer. So, if you call me professor, I won't correct you, but I'm not, I don't do any research. I'm not tenure track. I just teach. So.
Yeah. You can call me anything, just don't call me late for lunch.
Yeah.
Right.
My students sometimes call me Mrs. Tamkin, and I do say, no, I worked a long time for the doctor.
Oh my goodness. Names today, but that's another story. Thank you for this introduction. This is a wonderful introduction to this article in this theme issue. And I want to dive right into that. You've mentioned fire, so let's start with that. And that term, just lay that out, and then we'll move to the theological doctrine questions. But first of all, just tell us that fire, and then we're going to open the mics, and we're going to start with Del Kuhn's question today. But tell me what that acronym means.
Faith-Infused Reconciliation Ecology. So the paper by Vendrat and they had this term reconciliation ecology, but that is not just a Christian term, it's also a term in ecology, and so we wanted to kind of make more explicit that we're talking theologically. And so they add the faith infused part in their article, and so we just made it more explicit. So the idea that we are talking about reconciliation with the world, with creation that God made, and it's from the faith perspective. That's, I think, what that means. I don't know. David, is that fair?
That's a good summary. I agree.
All right, very good. Thank you. So with that, we're going to turn and open the microphones, and you'll be able to unmute yourself. And we're going to begin with Del Kuhn, who is always firing up our conversation by having a question for us. So Del, would you get us off today with your good question?
Yeah, thanks, John and Abigail and David. I really appreciated the article, particularly because it brings us into creation and not separate from it. A question to, I guess, kick off is take specifically the transformation of the American West in the late 19th century. We killed off the bison herds, we plowed under the prairie grasses, we've replaced them with crops. How would you approach that? And I'm specifically from the ecological perspective, ignoring our treatment of the Native Americans who were there. But from ecology, we have a half a continent transformation experiment with a clean beginning point, kind of clean end point, a century plus to look at the results. Is this a decent case study?
So, well, David, I feel like I've said a lot of things first. Do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I guess my first thought is, yeah, that seems like that does seem like a valid thing to ask. What does reconciliation ecology look like in this case? But it's a very, very big thing, and I am terrified of trying to answer that question, right? Because there's so much involved in it, right? You've got livelihoods of, I mean, honestly, the economic structure of the whole country, multiple countries, maybe you count Canada, and like deep historic injustice. So I think there is something to say, yeah, we need to recognize that a wrong's been done and repent and seek to reconcile. I would be very hesitant to start guessing at what that looks like, because I think that would get contentious very quickly. But I think that would be a worthwhile thing to do, if there was, the will to do it.
But I think tying what you're saying to the 5 steps that Warner's et al. Talk about, and that we have in our article too, the steps of reconciliation, recognizing that a wrong was done, so awareness, lamenting personal complicity, repentance, and then so I think you stated those 2 already, and then the question is, well, then what do you do with restoration, acceptance, renewal? But I think it's so important to do those first 2 because you don't have any hope of doing the other ones if you don't have any recognition that wrong was done. And I think that humility is really hard. Like, brazen confidence is like an American virtue, and having humility and regret is really hard. So Dilkun, do you have I feel like I don't know if we're answering the thrust of your question or not. Do you have more guidance for us in your question?
Okay, well, I'm going to ask something like I'm not that convinced that what we did was a sin. I think what we did was correct in our role of caring for creation, modifying creation to our benefit. And that's different from possibly making a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Easy to say, well, we got to strip mine or something like this. What's obvious what to do. We all probably have a feel about, let's not deforest the Amazon. But what about something that we really have done that in a lot of ways has benefited a lot of people? Increasing population in the 19th century. I'm sure we're feeding more people from the Great Plains than it could have supported in the state we found it in. And yet, the aquifers have been drawing down. We've known that since 1980 or so. Maybe we just haven't paid the price yet. How would
We probably paid some price with the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, if I use the term tree hugger, I'd have to go into hiding. But it's a practical situation, and yet there's probably a price to be paid, and yet maybe it was the right thing to do at the time. So I'm not going to jump into, boy, we've sinned again. Maybe we haven't, but maybe we're not. Maybe there is something in our treatment of the natural world like that we should be thinking about and taking forward into whatever is going to be next.
Yeah, and perhaps I was a little hasty in assuming that, I think there are some pretty obvious sins committed during that time period, and I would think especially the killing of the buffalo would in my mind be a more clear-cut case. But the transformation of the plains into agriculture, I think that's worth thinking about and asking, what does good management of that look like? And I think there's a good point to be made, Abby. You mentioned the Dust Bowl, but we have changed the way that we practice agriculture since then, largely because of the Dust Bowl, right? We've got the Natural Resource Conservation Service, where our department at Ohio State was often talking about conservation agriculture. So I think we can celebrate the ways that we have learned from our mistakes and tried to do better, while still saying, "Hey, let's continue talking about this."
And I think something could be unwise without being a sin. There's a spectrum of is something sinful? Is it unwise? And then are you talking about a personal level or a corporate level, right? But I think regardless of where we would do that, we could still grieve that for whatever is lost. That doesn't mean that we should try to go back, because this is the problem with the restoration ecology as well. What are you restoring to, right? Is a classic question. What you alluded to, you're saying because you were going to say pristine, and then you were like, oh, well, no, the way we found it, right? Which is a good point, but it's always changing.
It's whatever it was in 1870, which may not have been what it was like, 1,000 years before that.
Right.
Was it ever pristine?
Yeah.
Maybe before the first Americans came over.
Yeah.
This is very
But that's
good.
not-
Thank you.
Yeah, just like to toss in something about David. It's not just the buffalo. There was an entire ecosystem. The little things in the grass, also suffered. But that,
Sure.
and kind of end of my point. Just want to see where other people are going to go with this.
Yeah, thank you.
That's very good, Del. I thank you for ending with that. This is very fruitful because it makes the question more complex than a simple binary. And we know in restoration ecology, as Abigail pointed out, restoring to what? And it's not a stationary point. Nothing's a stationary point. So that's one key piece. And the other is there are more players that when you talk about we did this. Who is this we speak of? That conversation needs to be come into play as well. But that's for a later point in the. I think I saw a hand up. Carlos, did you have your hand up to ask a question?
Yes, I did.
Very good. Go ahead.
So, as I recollect, there were during various times during the westward movement, there were people who were objecting to what was going on. Would they be a source or a good starting point for some kind of a reconciliation conversation?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Understanding, well, I think, man, I think when you're dealing with something that reaches that far back, right, where it's not in my experience or my parents' experience or my grandparents' experience, we're reaching further back. You really need to try and understand the way that people at the time were thinking about it. Not to absolve them, but at least to understand what they were doing. And then acknowledging that not everybody was thinking the same thing, I think is an important part of that. So I think that their voices would need to be heard as we try to grapple with what reconciliation looks like. Yeah.
And I think something that we kind of touched on in our paper was that we're not advocating for just leaving something alone. That because I think the perspective that, well, the earth would just be better off if there were no humans, that does not jive with the whole Imago Dei thing that we're talking about. That God put us here, He trusted us, so we have some responsibility. So there's a paper by Paul Santmeyer that I remember being really influential for our conversations before, and he talks about ways that we care for creation or we interact: awestruck, contemplation or wonder, sensitive care, and those kind of those make sense to us, kind of intuitively, like, oh yeah, if we're in this conversation. But then the creative intervention, and then we kind of channeled that in on our paper to like working with nature. So like we talked about creating varieties of apples and or like breeding dogs from wolves. And so it's not that the apples, it's not that the wolves are gone. It's not that wild apples don't still exist, but there is something like new that's created where we are like working together with creation. So yeah, I think that wraps up what I was going.
And I would say probably our perspective as engineers, certainly my perspective as not just an ecologist, but an ecological engineer is, yes, there is scope for me to manage nature. And as you were mentioning, the landscape 200 years ago, 300 years ago was affected by people, and that's not necessarily wrong, right? So we shouldn't say, okay, we need to remove our influence, but we should ask, what is our influence doing? Can we change our influence so that promotes more flourishing on behalf of the non-human creation and the human creation? We're responsible for each other as well.
Yeah, which I think Del, you alluded to with being able to feed people.
Exactly. Yeah, that's under our mandate.
Yeah.
That's one of the interesting things about your article and the focus on the doctrine of the Imago Dei and what that means is that notion, the cultural mandate, sometimes it's shortened to, has a richness to it that invites other threads into the conversation, other voices into the conversation, other questions like these start to arise. So it's really helpful to start to think about that, think about these questions in this way. And Carlos, to your point, to the other voices, I sent a little note around earlier to Abigail and to David, mentioning that about 20 years ago, I wrote a little essay on what I called bison questions under the big sky. And that was my thinking on exactly the question that you asked. What has happened? I live here in Alberta, in Edmonton, at the northern edge of the prairie. It's a place where within an hour's drive, 1,000 bison were brought here in the early 1900s, and it was the kind of remnant of what was left from about 60 million, we estimate, 60 million animals that were there on the prairie. And after that decision was taken to transform it, the question is, all right, you're going to transform, but you have, as engineers know, you have options now. And those options often come down to how fast do you want to do it? How much are you willing to pay? And how much are you willing to forego and conserve? You have all these kinds of questions that come after you ask the first question. Oh, we need to do this thing. And Carlos, there definitely were voices, because the thread of racism, the doctrine of discovery, the doctrine of manifest destiny, which saw it was inevitable that this wave of Europeans would sweep over and replace, and all the kinds of stuff that comes to us. All of those issues and questions were alive and well, and there are voices there. But you have to look for them carefully. And there are voices there within the enforcers in the U.S. Cavalry, for instance, letters from officers who are on the front lines, seeing things that they said. So there are stories there to be told. And what your article does is just opens this up for us to have. I put in the chat a book by Alan Jacobs, Breaking Bread with the Dead. We can go back and have conversations that are much less emotional than talking about climate change today, for instance, would be, by talking and looking back into the past. So I need to remind you, as we're going forward here, I'm going to ask another question, but if you look on the reactions at the bottom and go into that reaction section, you can use a raise hand if you wanted to ask a question. And but if not, I'm going to move to another question, because I don't see anybody in the audience just yet. I want you to unpack a little bit.
I see a physical raised hand. Harry.
Okay. Here. Who was that?
Harry Cook.
Go ahead and unmute.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. I also would like to mention as we think of the Great West, that question, I just want to say the importance of the Canadian, the Nature Conservancy of Canada and its US equivalent, that does so much to preserve all kinds of biotopes and so on. So maybe it's a little bit after the fact, but I value the work that they do.
That's a little shout out from Harry Cook, who's here in Edmonton with me. Harry also is aware of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which began here in about 2009 here in Canada, modeled much after the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and has been a pathway to opening up these kinds of conversations and discussions, and taken Canada in some very fruitful ways, I think, in terms of ongoing conversations about what we call here First Nations people, but it's First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So it's really three different people groups with quite distinct cultural histories that are in the conversation with all these that we sometimes euphemistically call Europeans, but now people are typically calling, we're the settlers, we're the people who came later. All right, now we have two raised hands. I see Keith Miller first, and then we'll go to Terry Gray. Keith, would you unmute, please, and take us down the road?
One voice in this that I have come to highly regard is Robin Wall Kimmerer, with her braiding sweetgrass, and also the more recent one called the serviceberry, which she focuses on economics, that our current economy is extraction based. It's assumes unlimited resources. GDP has to increase every year, or otherwise the economy isn't doing well. And trying to argue for a different way of doing economics that she calls the gift economy. I don't know if you have heard that or what your response to that is, but that appealed to me very much.
I've read bits of her. Can you tell us like a little bit more about what that gift economy means for us?
Yeah, that everything is a gift. So native and indigenous perspective is that everything they use has been a gift from the creator. And that exchange, you don't have things, it isn't based on profits, but based on mutual sharing. So almost a kind of a bartering kind of economy. So that not only are we receiving a gift from the creator, but we're gifting each other with the produce and the benefits of creation.
What it
So
does,
let's
Abigail, what that does is, just to flesh that out a bit, in terms of economists, or pardon me, engineers and developers would think about this. Land is seen only in econometric terms. It has an economic value. But we know that standing behind that are a range of other values and utilizations and functions. Now, we have legal processes. The Environmental Protection Act starts in the early 1970s, US in a whole suite, whether it's air, water, blah, blah, blah. So there's all kinds of guidance that's given around it. The framing that Keith is talking about is framing land not just as economic value and in a means of exchange and growth of an economy, but as a gift. And that changes the value equation. How's that?
Yeah. Well, and then it's less about exclusive ownership too, right?
Yes.
And less about claiming it's ownership.
The common good. It moves toward the common good.
Yeah.
And it puts it in cosmic terms, which the doctrine of the Imago Dei does as well. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm reminded of, I can't remember the quote, but I'm reminded of a book by Henry Nouwen. Probably not saying that right. The Downward Way of Christ, or the self. Anyway, he talks about. My husband and I read this for Lent one year, and there's a line in the beginning about like how unimaginable it would be for someone to run for office in the U.S. on the platform that GDP should remain stable, like should not increase, and that's just like bonkers. And it's, so the idea of not seeking after like unrestrained growth is crazy, right? Like to not want to just grow uncontrollably. And I think it's interesting that something that, so we have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and so something that we've really talked about is like not seeing things as being scarce, but having an abundance mindset and having generosity being like key things that we talk about. And so ironically, I feel like that, like the unlimited extraction versus like that assumes that even though you're trying to extract something unlimited, you're doing it because you're worried about the scarcity. And so I think there's like an irony there where, but if you're focused on abundance, then you don't have to scramble to take everything because you can rest in knowing you have what you need. So I read an article back when COVID was happening where someone was arguing that like sermons should not be podcasted because then that decreases their value because they're not scarce. I just thought that was a really strange way to think about any gift of God, is that we should hoard it and not share it because we're worried about it, because we need to make it more valuable by making it scarce. I don't know. That's anyway.
It's a motivation not to witness.
Yeah.
David, you want to add?
Yeah, sure. This I've read Braiding Sweetgrass and really really enjoyed it. Actually saw a lot of resonances between what Walt Kimmerer was saying and what we were learning in Ensemble over the years. So I've got The Surface Barrier on my to-read list now, but this reminds me of reading Deep Economy by Bill McKibben, which was quite important for me at one point. I'll say one practical thing that came out of that. One of the premises of that book is, for a long time, the pathway to a better life has been more stuff. But like in modern America, that is not true. And in fact, more stuff is often an impediment to the better life. So one of the questions he asked is, yeah, you probably have enough money for groceries, but you probably don't have enough good conversations in your day. How many conversations do you have at the grocery store versus how many do you have at the farmer's market? That was very convicting for me. I started going to my farmer's market thinking, oh, I'm going to spend more money, but that's okay. I have enough money. What I'm going to get is deeper relationships. So I've heard that from several sources, reframing our understanding of what is wealth, maybe, or what leads to the good life. It's not just an abundance of material things. I mean, hear it from several sources. This is Jesus, right? Be on your guard. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions, which recently it's hit me that basically says it's a trap. It's a trap. Don't fall for it, right? Yeah. And we still fall for it all the time, myself included. So ultimately, I think, speaking as a Christian, right, the key to that for me is trusting in God's abundant provision, even when it looks like there's scarcity in my life, to say, no, I trust that God gives me what I need. Being a missionary who raises his own support for salary, right, has really driven that home for me, where the first time I finished and I was like, oh, God gave me everything that I needed, and I guess if I need more, he'll give more to me. And it's actually always been this way. Even when the Ohio State University was cutting my checks, it was God providing for me. That's been a very meaningful way of thinking for me that I'm very grateful for. And apply inconsistently, as I do everything, right? But I try.
Thank you for that. I'm just I'm reading the screen. We're all sort of gently smiling because we're thinking back to our own lives and how God has provisioned us again and again and again. And that reminder in itself is terribly important. And your article does that by bringing us to the Imago Dei. We are God's image representatives, vassals, contributors, encouragers in this place. And so thank you, Keith, for that question, because it's very encouraging in this conversation. There's so much more to say there, but we have a raised hand, Terry Gray. Terry, could you unmute and let us know what your question is?
All right, thank you. I'm getting weird internet signals, so I may cut in and out. So sorry about that. Hopefully I can get my question across. Thank you very much for the article. I really appreciated the emphasis on image of God and on the prophet, priest, and king, and on the new heavens and the new earth. You know, those are all themes that I really, really resonate with. One place where I don't know if I'd say I disagreed, but I had sort of some questions was when you were talking about personhood, and the personhood of non-humans, and I'm I'm very comfortable talking about human personality and personhood and the importance of that. I can talk about God's being a person. I can talk about angels even being a person. But I got a little nervous when we were talking about um, you know animals and plants and the personality, the personness of those things. And so I know it's personhood probably isn't exactly the same as image of God, and you seem to distinguish between them. But I'm just wondering if if you wanted to expand on that or defend that a little bit. I might want to restrict uh, people and angels and God, and even I'm willing to give personhood to unborn children as well. They don't have to have be able to talk and communicate and interact the way adults would. But I'm not sure I'm willing to give that to plants and animals.
So welcome to the conversations in ASA.
Yeah.
No matter how good your paper is, we all have questions.
Oh yeah. Well,
It's great.
Very-
Great.
This is definitely going to be a David question, but I'll just situate where we're talking about. So this is page 165 at the top right. I think this is where you're talking about. So in referencing The Embers and the Stars, Erazim Kohak, which is one of David's favorite books, I've own it. It's on my shelf. It's very philosophical. But he suggests that it is at least as valid to consider creation as a society of persons. So there we go. Look at that.
Yeah. Right. And then
that's where you're talking about.
In the next paragraph, it starts out relations between human and non-human persons.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yes, David, go for it.
Yeah, great. No, I thank you so much for this question. And in my mind, this is one of my more scientifically heterodox ideas, but one that I'm very excited about. So I read The Embers and the Stars because it was in the ensemble reader, and very challenging book for me. I'll try and give my impression of what Kohak was arguing for there. It was that in our culture, we generally carry around the idea that the universe is composed of particles in motion, right? That's how you think about things. Atoms, they've got a momentum and a position, right? Or a pressure and a temperature, and that defines their state and perhaps their future states. And he says, okay, that's a useful way to think about things, but it's not the only way to think about things. And argues that historically people have considered the universe as more of a personal thing. And not human persons, not necessarily beings with consciousness and will, but as things to which I relate, right? Where I can look at this tree and not just say, oh, look, a collection of atoms that has formed itself into this machine that transforms sunlight into sugars and lignin and etc. It is that, but I could also acknowledge some kind of personhood and have some kind of a relationship, right? And again, it's like, oh boy, you could probably very easily go one direction and hug the tree and expect it to hug you back, maybe. But I think there is a caution there against saying, yeah, the tree isn't just an instrument that I can dispose of like any other instrument. I think Kohak is especially concerned about meaning. He contrasts the world of nature with the world of artifacts. And he says an artifact is created by a person for a particular use, and it has no meaning outside of that use. Which we can argue with him about that, right? Whereas a tree is not an artifact. It has some inherent meaning within itself. So to me, the thing I've really appreciated is saying, okay, if I can, in some sense, have a relationship with this tree, not like it would with the person. And that means, I think in our context, that that relationship can be broken and maybe needs to be restored. I think it is a very countercultural way of thinking, and I'm not necessarily expecting everyone to be as enthusiastic about it as I am. And I do welcome pushback against that, right? But I think it is a philosophical orientation saying, yeah, it perhaps the tree is a collection of atoms structured to do a certain thing, but so am I. And if I can say that there's some kind of personhood attached to me, maybe I can acknowledge a less or a different kind of personhood attached to the tree. I'll say one other thing, but I'm getting out of my depth here. I've come across a couple times the philosophy of Do You Word, who's a Reformation era philosopher with, I guess, a highly elaborate theory of reality. There's this great paper by Gunton et al. In Trends in Ecology and Evolution, I want to say 2017 or 18, where they're critiquing the ecosystem services concept and building a new concept based off of Do Your Words, a spectral theory, which now instead of 4 services, you have 17 different aspects, which is beautiful and like very impractical, but I love it. But my very shallow understanding of Do Your Word is that objects can participate in active or passive roles in all of these different aspects. And that might be a more nuanced understanding of myself versus the tree, right? I maybe have more active roles in things like volition or consciousness, and the tree might have some passive role. Every so often, I think I should read Do Your Word and see if I have the correct understanding, but it's like a 3-volume set. And every time I see that, I'm like, maybe later. So I don't.
Doing Word is a challenge. But I was going to say something about doing word in response. So I'm thrilled that you brought it up.
Yeah.
Maybe either one of you could spell his name for us.
Dooyeweerd.
I think there are 2 E's.
Yeah. So, but anyway, doing word has this idea of individuality. And that it's I think it maybe accomplishes some of what you're trying to do without calling it personhood. And so that there's a uniqueness. We don't just have this generic tree or this generic oak tree that's a member of this species, but each oak tree has its own unique individuality structure, and can't fully be characterized by our scientific or even non-scientific descriptions of it. It is a unique creature of God, and we relate to it uniquely because of that. So I'm very happy with that sort of way of putting it, rather than giving personhood to the tree.
Yeah,
but I think it might be capturing some of what you're trying to get at.
Or you have Capon in his first chapter where he says a place is a meeting of persons, and you're here to meet with this onion. I'm not getting the right, but the first chapter of this is Supper of the Lamb, which is wonderful. And the first chapter is like walking you through how to meet an onion, and it is a meeting of persons, and you and the onion are both persons. So that's another place that language pops up.
Yeah, so I think it's probably just different valences attached to the word person, right? And certainly if I'm talking about the personhood of the onion, there are different valences than the personhood of a human being. And maybe Do Your Word actually gives us a better way to think about that. So if you know about like a nice summary or something of Do Your Word's philosophy that won't take me like 6 months of my downtime to read, I would be very interested in that.
We can give you a nice summary of Do Your Word. All you have to do is go to the ICS, Institute of Christian Studies in Toronto, and take a PhD there. and
Oh, okay.
you can be immersed into it, and you can get the thumbnail
You can have
sketch.
another one of those.
Have you seen a thumbnail sketch of any philosopher? Okay. Thank you, Terry, for that. It's a very important qualification and clarification of what's going on here, because it's a critical question. And I think in our common discourse, I just used that again. I challenged that word before. When we use words, we assume a certain definition, except there's a richness, and that's what philosophers do. And linguists and humanists like Alan Jacobs, in reading these folks that ask us to think behind the words we're using, because the words are ciphers for these full and rich concepts, and sometimes we reduce them down. And the we is actually very complex when you talk about it. So I want you to talk a bit more about the relationality, because I think that's where you end here, is you give the three different views and you end with a relational one. You seem to land on that, and you want to just expand that.
Oh, like views of the Imago Day. Is that what you're talking about?
Of the Imago Day. That's right. I thought maybe
yeah, I would say we lean more towards the functional view, but the relational view is certainly part of that. So the three kind of views of the Imago Dei roughly are structural, which is focused on physical and mental particularities unique to humans. The relational, which says that we are image bearers because of our relationship with God. And then the functional view, which is focused on like what is our function as humans. So obviously there's all of those, there's aspects of all of those that are true to what it means to be the image of God. The relational one, so Douglas Hall has a nice way that kind of like combines some. So he talks about he says, if humanity is endowed with any qualities that are different from the qualities with which other creatures of God are endowed, so that's like the structural view, these human qualities should not be considered ends in themselves, but only a means for the fulfilling of its relational ends. So I think he does a good job of like combining those two. But the downside of focusing going without the functional view is that the relational view and the structural view can be very cerebral or very like tied to the soul, or like what is the essence of a human, and can leave aside the embodiment of a human. So I think that's why the functional view is really important, because it situates us like in a physical location and with physical tasks to do. David, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I'll also say the structural and the relational view, I think they're a little bit fragile in that you say, oh, humans are special because we have language, and then you're like, oh wait, other creatures maybe have language too, or something like language. What is language? When is it language and when is it not? And I think that works for both the structural and the functional, the relational view. Other creatures also relate. Maybe we can argue about trees, but like chimpanzees relate to other chimpanzees, right? And maybe they don't relate in quite the same way as humans, but where exactly are you drawing the line? So I think both of those are important. Hall's book was amazing for me, thinking about how relationships are essential to our humanity, right? But I think that functional view kind of brings those things all together and says, and here's why we have those qualities and that capacity for relationship. It's so that we can fulfill this function within God's creation.
Thank you for that. I'm reminded of questions like this when they come up. You have three, you get to choose. It's kind of like, are you a human or are you a man? Are you a human or are you a woman? Which are you? Tell me. And and you say, well, I'm both. How can you be that way? Or as I think it was Mr. Johnson said years ago, your options are to be shot or hung in the morning. Isn't there a third option available? here. I think this kind of conversation is one in which we need to enrich, and you have certainly enriched our thinking with this article. Thank you for the effort you made and for this conversation today. It's been really helpful to all of us. Since I don't see any hands raised, and I'm tempted to keep this going for another 45 minutes or an hour, because if you see in the chat, I have written and thought about this for the last 40 years or so academically. And before that, I said I grew up on a clear cut. It was the first article that I wrote about this. I grew up on a clear cut. Oh, we all grew up on a clear cut. That's what happened in North America. And I think, oh, there are so many different options. Thank you for putting this forward. I'd encourage you to continue thinking and writing together. It's very fruitful for us. This area of, some people call it eco-theology, environmental theology. I like to call it creation care theology, is one that is rich. We've touched on some of the literature. The Asabel Institute has been a center for this kind of thinking for the last 40 some years. And the ASA and our journal has also been a place in which there are many, many articles, lots of thinking about this. So thank you again for doing this. And in closing today, I'm just remind you that next month, same time, it's always second Saturday, we return to our journal, Perspectives in Science and Christian Faith, for a related topic. We'll be drawing on another article in our September issue from a pastor academic at the Akrofi Cristallar Institute of Theology in Ghana. Ebenezer Blazo will be with us for his article, African Theocology, a Theocentric Paradigm for Creation Care in the African Church. And I really would encourage you to reach out to people you know in missions, in the church, that you know, let them know that this is coming up, because what I see Ebenezer doing is opening up for us in a new way some really rich thinking that he's been doing, but many have been doing in Africa, in Ghana, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in South Africa. Each of these countries has groups of Christians, and the way they receive these ideas of creation care is quite different from the way it's received through a North American lens. So I think that'll be a fruitful conversation. So if you join us in a month, we will appreciate it. Once again, Abigail and David, thank you so much. Have a great day.